Hello, my name is Louis Moffa. I'm a upcoming third-year PhD candidate at Columbia University, and I study medieval literature, specifically Dante. And I'm here with my colleague Chaz today to talk about Paradiso 2.
I'm also at Columbia University, rising second year, with very similar interests to Lou in medieval literature and its intersection with philosophy.
I guess before we get started, is there anything that you want to say, Chaz, about any particular reason why you were drawn to speaking about the second canto of the third cantica?
Well, what I find very interesting about the second canto is this is a real transition between worlds, between realities in the poem, because as we're hitting the moon, we're moving between the sublunar realm, right, and then above the sublunar realm, with the moon, of course, as the nexus of these 2 points. And so we're going to see a lot of warping of physics, of metaphysics, of our entire understanding and all different facets of philosophy. And it's not one that's as beloved as some other canti. So I think it's a great point to bring some love to the second canto of Paradise.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. I particularly am drawn to all of Paradiso, but this canto in particular because of just sort of the emphasis also on the astral and the way that Dante begins kind of using observational astronomy as a really like grounding point for the poem itself. It sort of takes over as the setting of the entire third cantica. And it's really malleable. He really kind of works with astronomy and with the heavenly bodies themselves as very tangible and almost alive parts of the poem, which we will see very much so later on in the second cantica. So I guess to begin, we can remind ourselves that it's still the beginning of Paradiso. So we are just leaving Earth, basically, right? In the canto that precedes Paradiso 2, right, Beatrice points out to Dante that you're not on the Earth anymore. You might think that you are on the Earth, but we are actually essentially flying through space at this point. And so that is basically where they are. And towards the beginning of the canto, the pilgrim and his guide will arrive actually at the heaven of the moon. So it opens with this very interesting, kind of address to the reader. O voi che siete in piccoletta barca, desiderosi d'ascoltar, seguiti dietro al mio legno che cantando varca, tornate a rivedere i vostri liti, non vi mettete in pelago, che forse perdendo me rimarreste smarriti. So basically says, turn around, go back, don't follow me. Which is a fascinating way to open up a poem. How would you define this kind of an opening? I mean, is it like a sfida? Is it kind of like it's like a challenge to the reader to really prepare themselves for something more difficult? How would you categorize this?
I think this could be taken very legitimately as a warning, not some reverse psychology move to really pay attention now and proceed forward. We're going to get into a very apophatic realm. We're going to see reason failing, and while it's very fun to talk about the limits of reason, it can also lead a lot of people astray, as he warns us itself, in a very legitimate way that can be disruptive to one's life, their religious life, their ability to function as a normative medieval citizen. And so I think this is very earnestly a warning, and based on Dante's experiences here, right, because we're supposed to believe this journey occurred, it was a very soul-warping experience in itself. It does actually require the right disposition to approach the following sections here. And also, as we see later in the poem, when we get to the ineffability of it all, right, I can't explain this, I can't explain this, that's because the reader is supposed to fill in the gaps with their own kind of mystic experience. And so it's not, even in terms of aesthetics, of the pleasure of the reading of the poem itself, it's going to have some prerequisites. It's not simply an elitist bit of erudition here.
Totally. Yeah, so in that sense, it really does speak to this apophatic nature, the sort of negative theology that's going on, that the almost the necessity for interpretation is going to be growing as the ability to sort of communicate what is happening in this third cantica grows more and more challenging. The ability to sort of put these sort of mystical, metaphysical experiences down into concrete, tangible words will, I think, be a through line for the remainder of the poem.
And based on how many universities, never cover Paradise lessons, I think this advice has been taken seriously.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I personally, as we now go through and talk about this canto, take this warning, very seriously as well. That okay, we need to, be careful. We're not on stable ground at this point. Passing sort of through this introductory section, when we get to verse 19, that's sort of where the plot basically picks up, and the poem begins driving forward with the concreata e perpetua sete. So this sort of, consubstantial and perpetual desire basically is what is physically pulling the pilgrim and his guide upward toward the heaven of the moon. Beatrice, right, rests a little bit above Dante, and he is gazing at her as he very frequently does. And essentially, right, they arrive at the actual sphere of the moon. Which is announced in verse 30 by Beatrice, che na congiunti con la prima stella. And so she refers to the heaven of the moon, right, as la prima stella, which to modern ears, rings a little bit weirdly, I think, at first glance, because right, the moon is not a star, as we know stars to be. As the moon is considered a luminary rather than properly a star, and does not shine with its own light, right, but reflects the light of the sun. Nonetheless, right, in Dante's time, they're still working with the Ptolemaic system, in which the real distinction amongst celestial bodies has to do with the distinction between the fixed stars and the wandering stars. So the constellations of the zodiac, all of the sort of constellations that lie at the outermost realm of the universe, are considered the fixed stars, insofar as they don't move in the same way that all of the other planets and luminaries, sun and moon, will move throughout the heavens. So the wandering stars, right, include the 5 planets that were known at Dante's time: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then the 2 luminaries, the sun and the moon. That is where we get the term prima stella here in the text. And the way that they arrive, right, at the actual heaven of the moon is kind of intriguing. I mean, it gets into a very sort of thorny discussion about whether or not, right, Dante went in his body, but he basically tells us that he was received into the heaven of the moon, like, what does he say? Like as water receives a ray of light, remaining uniform, right, staying the same, basically. So the physics here get a little wonky and kind of interesting.
The moment we really appreciate how different the entirety of our physics is going to be, because one, as you already mentioned, locomotion in Paradise is very different from locomotion in hell in Purgatory. Right? We have this transitive property, gazes as you will, or Dante looks at Beatrice looks, up towards the center of Paradise, and through this grace, it's, lifts them all up together through the knees. And then we have the entering in, we have this kind of mist of the moon, even though it's a true physical object and a meaning of the two. We almost have a very, very proto quantum mechanics kind of thing going on with mist coming from no precise location, interchanging diffuse, physical states. And Dante really appreciates how bizarre is what he's setting up here. And we can also think of the angels upon the tip of dancing on the tip of a needle, right? How many things can occupy the same space? This is a real scholastic question he's playing with here, and the basic mechanics of the setting, and really just flying by them, which leaves a lot of room for contemplation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of mechanics of the setting that you point out is a very instructive point, and it's interesting too to just sort of sit and think about. I mean, it's the thing that always captivates me with regard to Paradiso is that someone was looking up into space and then just started imagining, okay, what happens if I actually start flying there, basically, and that becomes the basis of the plot. I think what you mentioned about sort of the locomotion in Paradiso is incredibly unique. And, even if he's reusing some of the same metaphors and reusing some of the same concepts that he's already been developing throughout the poem thus far, things just take something of a different spin in Paradiso that is ultimately fascinating. Which then leads us right to the sort of crux of the canto, in which Dante just sort of asks the very simple question, what's the deal with the spots on the moon? I see these spots on the moon, and I'm just, what are they? Che son li segni bui? Literally, what are they? And his first sort of offered response is, sort of this popular legend that it has to do with Cain, basically, that Cain has created these spots on the moon. And obviously it's sort of put there as almost a straw man argument that is clearly not going to be the response that the text is going to provide us, but does nonetheless, give us a look into what the popular mentality would have been, or what maybe lay people would have believed the moon spots were caused by.
This is not the first question I would have if I made it to paradise myself. I think it's very interesting as this being the nexus itself, that's the first question that's brought to light. But it serves a good purpose in this kind of comic way we can approach it now, because we start off Paradise with refutation of Aristotelian thought, of a view that Thomas held, Averroes held. It has a very, very strong philosophical tradition that rarity and density is the cause of these different spots on the moon. And Beatrice explaining, this is proof that one cannot simply observe like we think in a scientific mindset, use our senses to collect data, nor can we even use logical demonstration. We encounter the technical term demonstration in the 44th verse, which is from Aristotle, which is this type of scientific demonstration with a syllogism. And so both syllogism and your physical senses are not going to be sufficient from this point forward. And so while it is a very funny first question to offer when we enter paradise, it very well demonstrates in a practical sense how reason is limited with this, because the true error behind Thomas and Averroes and Aristotle and this thinking about the moon is that if you continue using physical determinants to create identity, if the rarity and density as accidents are what cause this individual identity that can differentiate from something else, then what you're saying is everything has the same essence, because in order to have that as the determinant, that means essence is not the determinant. And so you have this issue when you get to the rest of the spheres, everything has to become unitary in a way that we know there is variety, a singular source, but we know that planets are not co-equal with each other, It's distribution. And we see this later on when we get to the fixed stars, have a variety, and from that variety it branches out even more. And this is a key solution that comes with this contradiction that Averroes had, which, if we have this unitary creator, a truly unitary one, he should only be able to create one thing, because you can't diversify and create two different things, because for one being to create two different things, you need to have two different aspects of yourself.
Right.
And so the necessity of this emanation here is happening, and this emanation does not work if you're going to have quantitative measures for differentiation, such as rarity and density. And so it's a simple, minute point that has a lot of ramifications, and why Aristotle is not going to hold the same weight in his physics here as he might have even with fantastical things such as the aerial bodies.
Mm-hmm.
As difficult as that was to process, several canti ago, There's no level that seems like solid ground compared to where we are now.
Yeah, and I think it's just so fascinating, that all of that, everything that you were just unpacking for us so fantastically, and everything that is in these verses that then, sort of grounds the conversation between Dante and Beatrice for the remainder of the canto, all is sort of spun off of this very simple, very mundane, very just kind of, almost rudimentary question. Why does the moon have spots? It almost sounds like the kind of question that like a child would ask their parent. Just like looking at the full moon. Yeah, exactly. Like, what's the deal with that? And I mean, it then turns into this entire incredibly erudite, incredibly difficult to follow. I mean, this passage has the second half of this canto is known to really live up to, right, the intro that Dante gives the canto, saying that this is going to be difficult, so be careful. It's just so incredible that something as simple as the moon spots can then just be used as sort of a launch pad for something that is just so much more difficult and challenging to both discuss and at the same time understand. And then, as you correctly pointed out, right, Beatrice says, "Ma dimmi quel che tu da te ne pensi," and his response is basically, right, the Aristotelian line that it's a difference in rarity and density, basically, of this one single substance. And again, Beatrice points out, that's not the case, and jumps immediately to La Sfera Ottava, right, the eighth sphere, which is the heaven of the fixed stars, the sort of apparatus that differentiates the matter that is coming from, right, God, essentially. That is sort of this process that as we move down, right, the heavenly spheres, things are being differentiated, and there's the line that basically the heavenly bodies, take from above and then basically act below, or che di su prendono e di sotto fanno. I think it's a beautiful canto, and one that's both challenging but also very rewarding. I think by the time you get to the end and find that the solution is in some ways very elegant, in some ways I think almost, I don't know, how do you experience the solution to the issue, to the question that's raised?
And really it's not possible to have a neat solution here, because we've been encountering this problem, at least since Plato, that how do we move from the unitary to the varied, right? And Dante himself is not a fan of variation, right? We see this in Convivio. And so while the fixed stars working down to this moon level, and the distance of the emanation is what allows this unevenness, right? In that it is truly a unitary, moon itself is a unitary principle, but it doesn't cast light so well as the fixed stars because it levels differentiation. We're still dealing with this difference of how do we move from the singular unitary to the fixed stars, and then to get this down to this emanation. Mm-hmm. And so it works well to correct over Aristotelian thinking, but it still does not escape through its infusion of Aristotelian language in explaining the Neoplatonic approach, the core problem with the Neoplatonic approach we've had this entire time. Mm. So it is sidestepping, but I do think it is very innovative in its incorporation of Aristotelian.
Absolutely.
For example.
Absolutely. What, according to you, what do you take out of Paradiso 2 that resonates with you, in the world today, in sort of, we're obviously living through a bit of a difficult moment, and, in general, we're almost 700 years, past the death of our poet here. What is it about Paradiso 2 that sort of rings resonant with you and, with just the world in general today?
Well, I think regardless of how religious one is, how Platonic or Aristotelian they are, a lot of this canto can seem very outdated and possibly boring, right, if you're not buying into this philosophy. I think it's still very important to remember how much exists beyond appearances, because this canto is ultimately about how the sublunar, realm and its way of defining things works in its place, but there is still more beyond that. And so wherever background is coming from, I think remembering that there's more to see beyond appearance is a good lesson to take, regardless of one's personal philosophy.
I just have spent a lot of quarantine looking at the moon, because I have, out my window I can sort of see the moon in the night sky, and every time I sort of look up at it, I'm reminded obviously of these passages, and reminds me of this wonder and bewilderment and curiosity that Dante very genuinely seems to have for the cosmos. For me, it's always that. It's always kind of looking up at the moon and wondering, why are there spots on the moon, and just kind of playing those same thought experiments in our heads. This was great, Chaz. Thank you so much for chatting with me today about Paradiso. And yeah, stay safe, stay well, and hopefully I'll see you soon.
Ciao.
Ciao.